Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I hope that this video finds you well wherever you are in the world. And continuing with my discussion of the works of John Carpenter, next in his filmography is this very great and unique work that is, I think, really pushing the boundaries in many respects. It's really trying for something different and fresh in the genre of horror, and in particular the genre of horror as seen from the great mind of the artist that is John Carpenter. The film is from 1995, and it is the one and only In the Mouth of Madness. This was released in the United States in 1995. I know it was released in other territories in the world a little bit earlier, so sometimes we might see this film being labeled as being a 1995 film or sometimes a 1994 film, but it's around the cusp, and so for purposes of this video, let's refer to it as released in 1995, with a script by Michael DeLuca and music by John Carpenter and Jim Lang, starring, of course, Sam Neill and Julie Carmen and Jürgen Prochnow and Charlton Heston and others, David Warner and others. And we have Gary Kibbe, who is the director of photography, and also produced by Sandy King and others. So this is a kind of well, on the one hand, it's a film that is a kind of exploration of the world of horror through the lens of H.P. Lovecraft and Stephen King, with the great spin that Carpenter and crew put on the proceedings. We have a film that seems to be very complex and dense. While it seems to be going from point A to point B to point C, along the way things happen to confuse the trajectory, and it therefore leaves us, the viewer, not necessarily knowing what's going on. There's a sense of disorientation and confusion swirled in a sense of chaos. But I think that's the point, and I think we are left feeling on edge and unbalanced and not necessarily having our bearings. And that, I think, gives us a further sense of deepening paranoia and unease that gives this film a real sharp edge to it. There is much more to this, of course. We have the way in which the sort of monster horror can also mix in with the kind of psychological horror, and that mixture, I think, is very fascinating, and it's given a nice tense and appropriate sense of balance by the way that the information of the story is revealed to us, the viewers, and the way that John Carpenter does, in his so great John Carpenter way, the way that he gives us a sense of suspense, a sense of character development, and a sense of pulse and entertainment. And oh yes, a great sense of disorienting sense of horror. And we have, therefore, here in a positive way, a kind of confusing horror delight with great performances at its center, Julie Carmen and Sam Neill in particular. And especially we must give kudos to Sam Neill for a very a very deep performance that has quite a steep arc of development as he goes from one point in his life to another point. And we see actually the opening and closing of the film where he is in a very different situation than we find him in the main bulk of the film, as it were. And I'll try to get into that in more detail later in the video. So this is in essence the film In the Mouth of Madness in sort of ambiguous terms. But still, I think ambiguous terms are quite appropriate, because this film has a lot of ambiguity to it, and it has a sense of confusion and uncertainty, which is the point, I think, and it therefore makes this film even more of a compelling watch. So its craft and its beauty combined with its just great unease really give this film a sense of urgency and a sense of depth that I think is on par with some of the best work from John Carpenter. In the Mouth of Madness, my friends. Then let's, as we always do, let's talk first about this particular Blu-ray, which is the Shout Factory, Scream Factory Blu-ray. And I want to say this is from 2018, so it's fairly recent, and it's really, really excellent. So the first thing that we have is the program, which is Horror's Hallowed Grounds with Sean Clark. This is around 11 minutes. And Sean Clark and crew go around many of the locations that were used for the filming of this film in and around Toronto, Canada. So we have the actual, for instance, the publisher's office where we meet Julie Carmen character and the Charlton Heston character, and also the place where there is a very famous scene early on with Bernie Casey and Sam Neill sitting at a table, and then someone approaches from outside with an axe. It's a very famous scene. And then we go into other locations that were used in the main part of the film, in a town called Unionville. There's also a place that was used for the Pickman Hotel, and the huge cathedral that was featured in the film, and the motel, and also the place that's used for the opening and closing, that really almost picturesque asylum, which is by the sea or by the waters. And this is, of course, a very famous iconic image from the film. And then we see the Eglinton movie theater, which is also a very key component in the film, and other places. So Sean Clark and crew go through these actual locations, and he tells us in very good detail how this was actually used in the film, and what the circumstances of the particular sites now, and that sort of information. So this is really great. This is Horror's Hallowed Grounds with Sean Clark. And then there is a 9-minute interview, which is called Whisper of the Dark. And this is the interview with the actor Julie Carmen, who is one of the co-stars of this film. And this is, as I say, it's 9 minutes, so it's not that long, but for a 9-minute interview, there is a ton of insight and information that Julie Carmen gives. Her performance in the film is really quite extraordinary for a number of reasons, because it goes in so many different places. But I think the fact that it's so fascinating and amazing, I think, is of course due in primary part to the acting talent of Julie Carmen. And she talks about how she wanted to give her character a sense of a kind of a sort of upper class feel to her, which would be a nice contrast to the Sam Neill character. And then we see her character develop as the pressures of the particular plot begin to apply themselves as the narrative progresses. But that's what her approach was, at least according to what she says in the interview. And she also talks about how how John Carpenter wanted to use the reference point of His Girl Friday, Rosalind Russell and His Girl Friday. And I think that's a really interesting point to make that Julie Carmen raises, because it really also indicates how John Carpenter really is thinking also in terms of classic Hollywood cinema, and how we've seen this in past John Carpenter works, but this is true also in The Mouth of Madness, namely that John Carpenter is really trying to play with past cinematic genres, or in other words, trying to blend them together in this film in his John Carpenter way. And so Julie Carmen's comment about this is really great. She also talks about a particular scene that she had with Sam Neill that was either shot but ultimately cut. There's a little picture, there's a still that's featured in the interview as she's talking about this. And she talks also about the other scenes that were shot but were that ended up not being part of the film, in particular something to do with the ending. And she also makes some really great comments about Sam Neill and his performance and his great talents as an actor. And she also talks about how this was in the 1990s, and we have to remember that perhaps around this time we were starting to feel like horror was becoming very prominent and also very relevant given the times. It was approaching the end not only of the century but also of the millennium. And so we have perhaps a sense of horror being escalated to coincide with this end, as it were. And I think she brings up a really interesting point about that. She also brings up the fact that she is a certified psychotherapist, and so she has some interesting insights into the way in which horror and the mind seem to be very much linked. And I think that is certainly true with John Carpenter's works, but in particular with In the Mouth of Madness. And she also has some comments about Jürgen Prochnow and reading H.P. Lovecraft and getting into her character. This is just a great interview. Julie Carmen is so wonderful to listen to, and she's just so filled with warmth and intelligence, and she expresses herself incredibly well. So this is Whisper of the Dark interview with Julie Carmen. Then we have an interview, a 60-minute interview with the special effects maestro, Greg Nicotero. And this is called Greg Nicotero's Things in the Basement, Monsters, Makeup, and Mayhem of In the Mouth of Madness. And here he's talking about the special effects that were involved in the film. He's talking here about the monsters, and he's talking about the monster designs, the creature designs, because there are a lot of creature designs in this film. And it's a film that has a lot of very intricate creature designs and special effects. So it's really great to hear him talk about this. He also talks about certain makeup designs. He makes reference to the contact lenses that were applied to the people who were affected by the particular menace that was at the heart of this film. He makes reference to cellular mitosis, which is very interesting. He also makes a really neat reference to the film Total Recall. And he also talks about the Sutter Kane novels and the cover art, and he also talks about the way in which the script was devised and really is laid out in terms of Sam Neill's characters. He calls them visions, which is an interesting way of describing it. He also talks about what was originally planned for the ending as a real sort of special effects a showpiece, but it ended up not going that way, but it ended up going with the ending that we actually see in the film, which I think is still an incredibly effective ending. But this is Greg Nicotero's interview, Things in the Basement. Well worth a watch. Very, very great interview. And then we have a segment which is called Home Movies from Hobbs End. These are basically videotaped shots or background or just videotaped footage of people talking in the backstages as people are getting made up in the makeup chair, looking at the creature effects as they're being practiced and they're being made and as they're being developed, etc. So this is all backstage videotaped footage that's all edited together in a sort of 12-minute montage, not montage, but just a 12-minute sequence like this. We also see the makeup and makeup tests, unofficial makeup tests and the like. So this is also really good stuff, especially if you're into the special effects side of things. And then we have what's called a vintage featurette. It's a 5-minute featurette, which is a sort of short making of featurette of the film that was made contemporaneously or contemporarily with the film itself, so 1994-95. It has an interview with John Carpenter as well, so you can hear him talk about how he's trying to pattern the Sam Neill character after like Philip Marlowe or other private investigator type figures in sort of pulp fiction literature, but also that kind of sort of hard-boiled cinema. So again, we have this film having its roots in sort of American cinema and the like. So really great stuff to listen to or to watch. And then we have the section for the trailer, the theatrical trailer, and then about a 10-minute section that has many different TV spots edited together. Now, I must say that the trailer, the original trailer that was used and the promotional materials that were used, the commercials and things like that for this particular film, I must say I was a kid growing up, or I was a teenager growing up when this film was released, and I do remember even now at the time that I remember seeing the trailer and I was so fascinated with the film. But when I ended up seeing the film, I realized that the trailer actually gave a lot of information and a lot of bits that ended up being in the final part of the film or the final scene in the film, etc. So it was a little bit of a shame that we saw all this footage, all these shots of the final bits of the film in the first trailer. But I think that goes to show just how effective the overall climax of the film is. It's probably some of the most memorable stuff that John Carpenter has ever made. So it's really worth watching. It's just maybe it would have been nice to have a trailer that didn't necessarily show what it ended up showing. But we see these shots, I guess, out of context, so we don't quite know how they play into the final film product. And I guess to say something in favor of the trailer, the film itself is of a type and character that you see a scene and it doesn't really make sense unless you see it in the context of the film as you're watching it. And so I think that has something to the trailer's favor. But still, it's something to think about. So if you haven't seen the film, I would actually recommend not watching the trailer to the film, but watch the trailer after you've seen the film and sort of after the fact, because it's as a kind of interesting way of promoting the film. It's worth watching. But if you haven't seen the film, try not to see it. Try not to see the trailer or avoid the trailer if you can, because it's worth watching the film as fresh as possible. And then the TV spots, similar thing. And then the Shout Factory Scream Factory Blu-ray is rounded out with not one but 2 commentary tracks. Brilliant stuff. We have one commentary track with John Carpenter and Gary Kibbe, who is, as I said, the director of photography of the film. Gary Kibbe and John Carpenter have worked together on many of the sort of films in John Carpenter's career, in the second half of his career, so to speak. And so to see or to hear Gary Kibbe and John Carpenter talk is great. They talk more or less in very technical terms about how this particular scene was shot, what lighting considerations had to be made, etc. But we do also get once in a while some comments from John Carpenter about Sam Neill and how he makes the gesture that's reminiscent of Humphrey Bogart. Again, another way that the film seems to be linking to to a kind of cinematic past, or cinematic Hollywood cinematic tradition of the past. And also Gary Kibbe and John Carpenter talking a lot about how this film was shot, the wide screens or Panavision look to the film, and how certain lenses to achieve that effect tended to warp the image, tended to bend certain lines of the image, which I think actually works to the great benefit of the film, because if the film is seen as being a kind of warped sense of reality, what's real and what's unreal, then I think this use of the Panavision it serves a visual purpose as well as a thematic purpose. And so I think, therefore, to listen to the Gary Kibbe, John Carpenter commentary is key. It's actually quite key. But that's not the only commentary track we see, because we also have a commentary track with John Carpenter and, this time, Sandy King. And of course, we know of the sort of professional and personal relationship that exists between Sandy King and John Carpenter. And so to hear them together and their really natural rapport with one another is really great. We also get some background information from Sandy King, who is very well spoken, incredibly intelligent, and has so much recall of information about this particular production. About, for instance, working with Charlton Heston, about working with the people at New Line Cinema, about other things about the production and the like, while John Carpenter gives us his very wonderful John Carpenter-esque commentary. He's very low-key, very down-to-earth, very humble, very modest, but still filled to the brim with information and background about this film. And he gives some great tidbits. There's one particular moment that he talks about, and he mentions, again, he mentioned things like Howard Hawks and His Girl Friday. He also mentions Louis Bunuel. He also mentions other things. And I really like the Bunuel reference, because I think he's trying to suggest that this film, In the Mouth of Madness, takes also a lot of cues from Bunuel, as well as taking cues from classical Hollywood cinema, as well as taking cues from Lovecraft, and to another extent Stephen King, and to another extent maybe even like the horror genre, the horror entertainment genre in general. And maybe even self-reflexivity in terms of John Carpenter's own career, and how it has developed quite an intense fan following and also critical following. And so I think, overall, this is a really great commentary that makes a lot of allusions to some key reference points. So this is the second commentary track for this film as released by Scream Factory, Shout Factory. A great release. Check it out if you haven't already. So with that, my friends, let me now say that from here on in, I will talk about this film with a little bit more detail. So if you have not seen this film yet, I strongly suggest that you turn off this video now and watch this film if you have the chance. And after you've seen this film, you can come back at any time, and it will be my pleasure, as always, my friends, to hear any thoughts that you have about this really unique film in the canon of the works of John Carpenter. This is In the Mouth of Madness. Okay, you're back. So this is In the Mouth of Madness. And I really love this work. I love this work because it's so confusing. Every time I watch it, I can never get a full grasp and sense as to what exactly is happening and has happened. Now, I think that lends itself, or that is another way of saying that this film has so many interpretations to it that are possible, I think, that that makes this film very fresh and very challenging and very rewarding a watch every time I see it. And I'll try to get to those in the final closing statements of this particular video. But as an opening statement, as it were, let me just gather my thoughts again about certain things that I might have mentioned earlier in this video, to suggest that this film is, like many other John Carpenter films, is having many links to many different genres, and whether they be in terms of literature or whether they be in terms of Hollywood cinema or American cinema or world cinema or maybe everything in between. So what do I mean by this? Well, first of all, this film, probably heart and soul, is the works of H.P. Lovecraft. And not only do we have certain specific references made to particular stories of H.P. Lovecraft, but we also have a kind of a narrative structure, a wraparound story, as it were, that is dealing with the John Trent character, as played by Sam Neill, and he's admitted to this asylum. And basically he is recounting his story to the David Warner character, and then that therefore goes into a kind of flashback structure, but then returns to the asylum as soon as the flashback part of the film has been completed, with the visit to Hobbs End for the search of Sutter Kane, but then finding out that there is a lot of a sort of melting of what we thought was a reality at the start of the film, but it melts to the point of becoming so disjointed and so disorienting that we don't quite know if what we had at the very beginning was a real reality to begin with, or maybe it was all in John Trent's mind. And everything that we see in the film is in John Trent's mind, or maybe it is actually the end of the world that has it's succumbed to the monsters and demons that have in some way manifested themselves via this vehicle that has been created by Sutter Kane. In other words, the inducement of some kind of illness or paranoia that leads to very violent tendencies and seeking to commit violent acts, as being influenced by something that is seemingly evil or something that is unnatural, as contained within the pages of the book In the Mouth of Madness. So, if once you've read it, you become forever possessed by it and forever affected by it, and that is leads itself to the film's overall narrative arch. Or arc, which is premised on this, but also it can serve as a metaphor for the spread of disease or the spread of illness or widespread paranoia or the breakdown of society and the devolution of society into nothing but chaos, where the pillars of sort of law and order are broken down in favor of chaos and destruction. So there is a sense of the decay of the world and the end of the world and end times, and it's, I think, expressed through many levels and layers of metaphor. And the question is whether this is all in the mind of John Trent or whether this is actually happening. It's very difficult to tell, and which is another way to say that this film lends itself very beautifully to many different interpretations. But the point is that I think this is all also part and parcel the soul, if you will, of H.P. Lovecraft and what H.P. Lovecraft's writing meant and what it was really about. And so we get not only the cosmetic details that I think can remind us of H.P. Lovecraft, but we also get the real soul of H.P. Lovecraft embodied in this film, in terms of how the story is structured, but also in terms of John Trent as a character and certain details that creep up along the way that remind us of particular stories by Lovecraft, etc., as well as a general sense of the feel of it. This idea of the paranoia and the psychological horror mixed in with the actual physical of tentacly, slimy monster horror as well, and that we also know that this is something very, very much attuned to that kind of literature and that kind of horror storytelling. So we have this link, which is, I think, very much one of the most important links that John Carpenter is making, and Michael DeLuca's script is making. But also we have, I think, links to this idea of horror as entertainment, horror as a genre that is an entertainment horror. In terms of literature, of course, we have, I think, Sutter Kane and Stephen King. I think the link between those two is quite undeniable. in terms of bestseller horror and the way in which stories can affect us. But also we have this idea of horror cinema and how that can affect us on a psychological level. You know, horror cinema, I think, has often been the subject of criticism in terms of this idea of maybe horror cinema affecting viewers in a negative way, or maybe causing those sorts of acts of violence to carry out. And this isn't meant to be a discussion of the psychological impacts of horror cinema, or the merits or demerits of those sorts of psychological studies with respect to the effects of horror cinema or horror entertainment on the viewer or the consumer. But I think the point is that kind of metaphor can also be layered into this film, and I think that link with Stephen King is very evident. I think also, by extension, it's a link to horror cinema, and maybe a self-referential comment about John Carpenter himself, and about this kind of filmmaking himself. So that, I think, is a very pointed and poignant link that the film is making here, and thus makes this film, I think, a very self-reflexive one, at least possibly so. But we don't just end there, because John Carpenter himself, in the commentary tracks, for instance, does acknowledge that he was also reliant on reference points that were provided by Howard Hawks, and things like His Girl Friday and Rosalind Russell, and that sort of classic Hollywood tradition. And we see that not only in the Julie Carmen character, and the way she carries herself, the way she tends to have a sort of sharp rapport with the Sam Neill character in the film. But also we see it in the Sam Neill character in how he has a sort of private detective type of role, sort of insurance-related investigator, of course, but it's like a private investigator, like a Philip Marlowe type, but also he has certain cadences and gestures that I think are on purpose supposed to be reminiscent of people like Humphrey Bogart, or maybe Robert Mitchum, or something like that. But he also has that that rough-edged feel to him, because he is a kind of pessimistic character. He's not an unlikable character. Actually, he's a very realistic character that sees the world in very pessimistic but realistic terms. And I think that makes his character, at least at the beginning anyway, I think very, in a sort of indirect way, very much a likable character, because he's not trying to be a bad guy, but he's just trying to catch bad guys. Right at the very beginning, we see him being very clever with the Peter Jason character, who is trying to apparently commit insurance fraud. And so he's just trying to get people who are just trying to commit fraud. And so there's nothing necessarily wrong with that. There's a kind of detective quality about him as well. So I think he is, even though he might seem as a character to be somewhat pessimistic, I think he's still very likable, and therefore he becomes a great way for us to enter the world of the film, because we see the film mostly through his eyes, although there's a segment around the first third of the film where we see the film through the Julie Carmen character's eyes, and especially as they travel from the real world into Hobbs End, and that very memorable sequence where she goes through the tunnel bridge and all that, and she sees the person on the bike with the little playing card that's making the little sound as the wheels turn, or something like that. But yes, for the most part, we are looking at this film through Sam Neill's eyes, and to have him be linked to sort of classical Hollywood style, the private detective or something, I think that's very much important when we're talking about John Carpenter and his filmmaking craft. And I think also, by extension, we can also find links to the film noir tradition, because we realize that there is a little bit of a ploy, or there's a little bit of an act or a ruse that's going on here in terms of Sutter Kane, and how this, at first anyway, might have been designed to be a publicity stunt, but it ended up being something that was beyond the control of the people involved. And so there is a sense of a film noir style to this, and also I think that's very apropos because as with many great film noir, the films like that are about a certain sense of reality that turns into a different type of reality by the film's end. We see this in many great film noirs, but I think that's very true also for In the Mouth of Madness, because we do start the film with a certain sense of reality that then just is totally upended by the film's climax, and so we're left unsure as to what's going on. And the hero, or the anti-hero, however you see the Sam Neill character, is left sort of totally and utterly bereft and without anything except watching a movie of what he has lived through and gone through, and he can only laugh, but the laugh turns into tears or an uncontrollable crying, which is one of the great moments in a John Carpenter film. But it's so emblematic of the real confusion and tension that I think it can be also seen in some of the great film noir traditions of the past. So there is a lot of linkages that are being made, and we've seen John Carpenter in his past films make a lot of linkages to the past like this. So to see him direct a film that has these similar sorts of linkages to a kind of cinematic past, I think is great. I should also mention that, as I was saying earlier, John Carpenter was mentioning how he was trying to channel Louis Bunuel. I think that's such a great comparison to make, because if we're talking about Louis Bunuel and generally speaking a kind of surrealist approach to cinema, but it's really a cinema that is playing with the traditional modes of cinema and just turning them on their heads to create something that is, I think, outlandish, but also very devilishly simple in terms of how he is trying to upend or uproot certain otherwise conventional norms of the cinematic tradition. Well, I think In the Mouth of Madness has many similar things going for it, because not only does it upend the norms of the Hollywood trajectory, or the standard trajectory of a horror film like this, but it also, I think, upends one's expectations, even with a film like this, because we have a film that is totally going in places that I was not expecting, and quite bizarre ways, but still ultimately very rewarding ways. For instance, the Sutter Kane character, the Jürgen Prochnow character, you would think that a character like that would be like the main villain, or the main henchman, not main henchman, excuse me, the main arch nemesis of the film. But far from it, he isn't really a villain or an arch nemesis, in the sense that he is more like almost like a ghostly, mysterious figure that ends up being just as mysterious when we see him as he was before we even met him to begin with. And so I think, therefore, he in a film like this, made by anyone else, one would have expected the Sutter Kane character to become the arch enemy of everyone, and it would be the whole point of the film to basically take him down. But the film doesn't do anything like that at all. It plays with him and his the way that he is perceived, and the way he looks to us versus the way he actually is, and how his face in the front is very different from his face from behind, if you know what I mean. And there is also a breaking down of the physical structures all of a sudden and without warning, that I think also is very much present in the best works of Bunuel. So the fact that John Carpenter made this specific reference in the commentary track with Sandy King, I think is such a logical and also a quite astute insight that John Carpenter provides. It's just so great. So that's yet another example of how he's trying to connect with a certain cinematic tradition in this film, In the Mouth of Madness. But that's not all, I think, because John Carpenter is also, I think, connecting with a lot of his own cinematic past. And we see, therefore, that this film, In the Mouth of Madness, fits very well in John Carpenter's filmography context, in the sense that it does have relationships to other films that he has directed. John Carpenter himself acknowledges in the commentary track with Gary Kibbe that at the very start of that commentary track, that this forms the third part of a loosely connected trilogy, a sort of thematically based trilogy, which he refers to as the Apocalypse trilogy. Starts with The Thing, then proceeds through Prince of Darkness, and ends with In the Mouth of Madness. And if we were to carry that loose connection of a trilogy to its conclusion, then we can say that therefore each film seems to be dealing with a scenario that is a kind of end-of-world scenario, played out at a different stage or a certain stage of that progression. We see this kind of played out in The Thing. We also kind of see this played out to a certain extent in Prince of Darkness. And also we see this played out again to a certain extent in the Mouth of Madness, this kind of this is an apocalypse trilogy, though, that I would suggest is these are stories that I think are bringing about end-of-world scenarios, and the reasons that these end-of-world scenarios are brought about in these films it might seem to be based off of some kind of external force or an alien invading force or something like that. But in fact, I would even suggest that in all of these films, but in particular in The Mouth of Madness, John Carpenter seems to be suggesting that the apocalypse that is arising in these particular scenarios, although the catalyst might be something that is external, in fact, the argument can be made that the apocalypse is coming about, or it is the catalyst of the apocalypse is nothing except what is from within, namely the cause of the destruction of the world is something that comes from within rather than something that comes from outside. And I think that's true for In the Mouth of Madness. Of course, on the one hand, we can look at In the Mouth of Madness and see these creatures, these monsters from whatever dimension that channel through Sutter Kane's writings through some means. And of course, the peeling back of this layer of reality then reveals the monsters, and they're trying to break through some kind of something like that. We do get a sense of that kind of maybe alien invasion force, if we can call it that. But we never see the monsters actually play out in real world scenarios or anything of that sort. And so, are these monsters actually real, or are they more figments of imagination? If so, if they're real, then that, of course, suggests an external force that would lead to that kind of hypothesis or that kind of theory. But on the other hand, if they are rather figments of imagination or manifestations of maybe a disturbed psyche, then I think that is lending itself to supporting the theory that this apocalypse is coming about because of reasons from within. And I love that dichotomy, and I love that there can be differing interpretations of that with respect to this film. Is it external induced apocalypse, or is it internal induced apocalypse? And I think either way is possible in terms of interpreting this film, or maybe a combination of the two. In any event, I think that's what makes this film very fascinating, at least in the context of this apocalypse trilogy that John Carpenter seems to be citing. I would also suggest that there are a lot of great connections with other John Carpenter works. In particular, I would say maybe They Live as well, I think is a great antecedent. And also Escape from New York also is a great antecedent, the way that film seems to be giving us further and further different, almost alternate senses of reality as we go deeper and deeper into the stages of New York. And the same thing here, as we go closer and closer into the real sort of heart of the matter. And we go into Hobbs End, and we travel further into Hobbs End and all that entails, and we see all the little details that sort of creep in, the children and their faces, and the dog that they're running around and chasing, what happens to the dog, and the cathedral, and what happens when you go into the cathedral, and the hotel in terms of the Pickman Hotel and Mrs. Pickman and what she's all about and where's Mr. Pickman. And when we see him, that's one of the most surprising, funny, and shocking moments of the film is what happens with Mr. Pickman. But my point is that the layers of confusion as we get closer and closer to the heart of Hobbs End and to the heart of Sutter Kane, I think, are also very reminiscent of how in films in the past, like Escape from New York, we get layers and layers of further confusion and an alternate reality. But there are also links mentioned. I mentioned Prince of Darkness and The Thing. I think there are great links to The Thing, at least on a sort of a visual surface, visual level, because of course a lot of the special effects that are being relied here, Greg Nicotero and others, are, I think, very reminiscent of the kinds of special effects we saw in The Thing, in particular, like the way the tentacles are used and the way that certain model shots or puppet shots are employed. Very reminiscent of the Thing monsters that we saw in that earlier film. And also Prince of Darkness comes to mind too, because I would say that Prince of Darkness as a horror film is a film that defies expectation. It seems like a film that should be of a certain type of genre, but then it goes into completely different directions. And I would say that the same is true for In the Mouth of Madness. This is a film that seems to be wanting to go in a certain direction in terms of genre expectations, in the way in which the John Trent character is on the case, searching for the lost author, and the lost author seems to be someone who is maybe possessed by these demons, and he's also very sinister looking, and he's disappeared, and he can be found essentially in this really amazing, very eerie-looking cathedral in the middle of essentially nowhere. And so this can probably lead to kind of a showdown between good and bad and that sort of thing. And will he escape this sense of hyper-reality or something like that, with demons and monsters trying to take over the world and destroy everything? I mean, it could have felt like that type of film, but in fact, it doesn't do that at all. It doesn't do that at all. Rather, that is used to lay the foundation and groundwork for a different exploration into the way in which reality and fiction are mixed together, the way in which our perceptions of the world around us, and thus ourselves, can be threatened and can be upended and upturned and completely shattered to the extent that we no longer know what the world around us is, and we no longer know who we are as people, as individuals, because we are so lost in a sense of confusion and danger and not knowing what is real and what is not. And I think that goes to the very heart of a kind of a discussion, of sort of philosophical discussion of sort of existential, or threats to sort of existential concepts of one's identity. And so this, and it's all placed upon the framework of what seems to be otherwise a kind of genre film entertainment. And so therefore this film provides a lot of different and unusual roots of cinematic expression that I didn't expect when I first saw the film. But when I saw the film, and now that I see the film subsequent times, I marvel at how it does these twists and turns within its own narrative to defy expectations, much along the lines that Prince of Darkness defied expectations. And so I like how there are these kinds of links that we see with John Carpenter and his own films and his own past filmography and film catalog. I mean, along the way of my discussion now, I've mentioned about how this film seems to be subject to many potential different interpretations. I mentioned how this could be seen as being a horror that is from the external world. These monsters are real or somehow real, and therefore they have a kind of effect or adverse effect on the people, and thus causing the end of world scenario that is really taking place by the film's end. Or this could all be seen as being an internal manifestation of a kind of damaged psyche for whatever reason, for whatever sense of trauma or the reasons for such trauma, how they came about. So this could be seen as a sort of internalized, intense examination of a real loss of a sense of reality. Or it could also be seen as something that is completely a figment of the imagination of the character, Sam Neill character, John Trent. We see him at the beginning being admitted into the asylum, and we know therefore that this is a story that is being told by him. So this could all be his vision or his dreams. And in fact, the film is edited in a way to suggest that many of these events that are happening could be his dreams or his visions as he is seeing them. And so the film doesn't give us clear answers as to what is actually going on and what isn't. And therefore, as I was trying to suggest earlier, every time I see this film, I can't get a full grip as to what exactly is going on. And I love the film for that. I think that is a very clever thing to do. I think it helps give the film a lot of longevity and a lot of life beyond its initial release date. And now it's the year 2020, and so many years have passed since this film was initially released, and it still has a lot of depth and a lot of scope and a lot of drive to it that feels still very fresh because its mysteries, I don't think, yield answers very easily, and I think that's really wonderful. Even by the film's end, there is a sense of confusion and disorientation as John Trent's sitting there after what seems to be the end of the world, but we're not really quite sure what's going on with that as well. And he's in the theater, and that is watching the events that we've just seen in the movie. And so In the Mouth of Madness is the film that he lived through, and he is a character in that. And so all he can do is laugh, but then it turns into sort of blood-curdling cry that he can't really control. Uncontrollable laughter, uncontrollable crying, all within the same moment. That, I think, is the perfect encapsulation of this film. It is everything and nothing all at the same time. You're not quite sure what the heck is going on, but it doesn't matter because it's great for that. So what a great moment that is. And I said it before in this video, but I'll say it again. That is one of the great moments in John Carpenter films. The way that Sam Neill handles that moment, it's just to perfection. Bravo, Sam Neill. Bravo, John Carpenter. Bravo, everyone in the crew for that moment, and for many of the other moments in the film, In the Mouth of Madness. I guess I can end with a few interesting, or not few interesting, but a few sort of miscellaneous things about this film that I thought was interesting. Of course, we get a very brief appearance, but from Hayden Christensen, and so that's, I guess, an interesting little tidbit. I mean, he is mentioned by John Carpenter and Sandy King in the commentary track, so that's interesting. So look out for Hayden Christensen if you haven't noticed him already. And as I mentioned before, I love the little details. I think one of my favorite moments is the Mr. and Mrs. Pickman, and that little brief moment of seeing Mr. Pickman at what's happened to him, and just not exactly knowing what's going on, but it doesn't really matter because it just adds that sense of paranoia and disorientation and confusion. And also there. I mean, I'm glad. I guess it's good that I mentioned that, because that's an example of how this film is a sort of cinematic inducement of this sense of paranoia, not knowing where you are, not having your bearings. You go through a tunnel and you're not sure what's going on. Is this real, or is it night, or is it day? Is this a church, or is this not a church? Is this the author Sutter Kane, or is this a monster with that's sticking out of the back of his head? Is this a picture, a painting on the wall, or is it moving as I'm seeing it? And those sort of things. Is this a dog with 3 legs, or are these children, or are these monsters, or that kind of strange disorientation that lends to a sense of paranoia, of not knowing if this is real, or what I'm seeing is not real. And what is it saying if what I'm seeing is real? if this is all real, then I am in very deep trouble. I, as a character, if I'm a character in the film, I would be in very deep trouble, and I should get the heck out of there. So, but what is it saying that this is not real? If this is not real, what is that saying about the nature of the particular psyche that is experiencing these visions at that particular moment? What is that saying about that? Again, that goes in so well with the notion of the breakdown of the notion of a perception of things around us, but also the notion of perception of our own individual sense of ourselves. And I think we see John Trent, the main character, go through that dilemma very slowly and gradually, but then to an extreme conclusion by the film's end. And so I find that to be a perfect way to express this idea of paranoia. The expression of paranoia in cinema via the cinematic expression of disorientation, confusion, and visual chaos, to give us a sense of not knowing exactly where we are or what is going on. And it's brilliant for that. So I think that also, and just to end on that note of paranoia, of course we've seen this in past John Carpenter films in terms of a paranoia of the state, whether that's in They Live or maybe also Memoirs of an Invisible Man, also paranoia of the other, when we've seen that, I think, to some extent in Escape from New York, but I think also quite majestically and marvelously and magnificently in the film The Thing. And also even to a certain extent films like Halloween and Someone's Watching Me. There's a sense of paranoia and not knowing what lurks in the shadows. But I think that kind of paranoia is given yet further voice in this film, In the Mouth of Madness. And so this continues the tradition of cinematic paranoia in the works of John Carpenter, this time as expressed in the utter and total cinematic chaos, the beauty of the cinematic chaos that is painted by this world and by the cast and crew of this extraordinary work directed by John Carpenter. I really mean that. This is really an extraordinary work. This is the film In the Mouth of Madness. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. What do you think of this film? Do you like this film? Do you not like this film? In any event, my friends, I would love to hear what it is you have to say about this work, In the Mouth of Madness. So please feel free to leave your thoughts and comments in the comment section below. So for now, I want to say thank you very much for your time and your spirit and energy and enthusiasm as always, my dear friends. And until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you once again for your time. Take good care of yourselves. Warmest regards to you all, and cheers.